It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday morning in Moscow, Idaho. The sun had just begun to pierce through the overcast November sky when the unthinkable was discovered. 4 bright, promising college students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were found brutally murdered in their off-campus home. No witnesses. No weapon. No suspects. But within that silence, the killer had left something behind. A single knife sheath, carelessly dropped next to one of the victims' bodies. It looked ordinary, standard U.S. Marine Corps issue. But hidden on the snap button? A microscopic trace of DNA. It would prove to be the thread that unraveled everything. The crime scene was gruesome, something straight from a nightmare. The attack had occurred in the early morning hours of November 13, 2022, while the victims slept. There were no signs of forced entry. No clear motive. The knife sheath gave detectives their first major lead. It was quickly sent to the lab for DNA analysis. At first, the DNA profile didn't match anyone in the National CODIS database. It could have ended there, a dead end. But law enforcement had a secret weapon: investigative genetic genealogy. Investigators uploaded the DNA profile to a public genealogy database used for tracing ancestry. Within days, they found a distant relative, a cousin. Through painstaking family tree reconstruction, they zeroed in on a name: Bryan Kohberger. A 28-year-old criminology PhD student at Washington State University, just 10 miles from Moscow. A man studying the very psychology of murder. Authorities obtained a sample of Kohberger's father's DNA from their family home in Pennsylvania, collected from trash. The result was damning. The DNA on the knife sheath was a 99.9998% match to the Kohberger family line. It was enough for a warrant. But the DNA wasn't the only thing tying him to the crime. Investigators pulled Kohberger's phone records and pieced together a chilling digital breadcrumb trail. His phone had pinged cell towers near the victim's residence at least 12 times in the months leading up to the murders. He wasn't a stranger randomly passing through. He had been stalking the area. Even more disturbing, the phone was turned off during the exact window of time the murders occurred. But just 30 minutes later, it reappeared on the network, southbound, headed away from the crime scene. The silence of his device during the murders wasn't proof of innocence. It was a calculated effort to erase his digital footprint. At the same time, surveillance footage from neighborhood security cameras began to tell a parallel story. Around 3:30 a.m., a white Hyundai Elantra was seen circling the King Road neighborhood multiple times. It slowed near the victim's house, then disappeared for nearly 20 minutes, only to speed away just after 4:20 a.m. Police put out a call for any white Elantras matching that description. One vehicle stood out, a white 2015 Hyundai Elantra registered to Bryan Kohberger. Security footage from Kohberger's university housing also showed him arriving back at his parking lot later that morning, wearing surgical gloves, according to FBI surveillance, and taking his trash out to the neighbor's bin. By now, the evidence wasn't just mounting. It was overwhelming. Facing a mountain of forensic, digital, and circumstantial evidence, Kohberger's legal team knew the case was not just strong, it was airtight. The DNA on the knife sheath alone could secure a conviction. Add to that the cell tower data, the surveillance footage, the vehicle match, and the fact that he had studied criminal behavior in detail, it painted a horrifying picture, not of someone who snapped, but someone who planned. A man who believed he could outsmart the system. Initially, Kohberger pleaded not guilty, and a trial date was set. But as court hearings began and the evidence was laid bare, the conversation shifted. Prosecutors had made it clear they were seeking the death penalty. And with that looming over him, Kohberger made a stunning reversal. In a closed hearing, he agreed to a deal, a guilty plea in exchange for the removal of the death penalty from the table. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, receiving 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For the families of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, the guilty plea brought a kind of closure, but not peace. The pain of their loss is permanent. But at the very least, the long shadow of the trial, the appeals, the spectacle, it ended. And so, in a quiet courtroom, justice began to take its shape. As the world tried to comprehend how such a horrific act could be committed, focus shifted to Bryan Kohberger himself. He wasn't an outcast. He had no prior criminal record. He was educated, brilliant even. At the time of the murders, he was a doctoral student in criminal justice. He studied under leading forensic psychologists. He had conducted surveys asking criminals about their thought processes during the commission of crimes. To many, it now seemed chillingly clear. He had been rehearsing in plain sight. Former classmates described him as intense, often socially awkward, with a fascination for the minds of serial killers. He reportedly struggled with feelings of isolation, rejection, and superiority. Had Kohberger killed not just for control or vengeance, but as a kind of twisted experiment? Despite the guilty plea, many questions remain unanswered. What was the exact motive? Why those 4 victims? Did he know them? Did he select them at random, or was it a dark fantasy made real? Prosecutors hinted at possible connections. There were rumors of online interactions, of social media stalking, of rejected advances. But nothing has been confirmed. Even in his confession, Kohberger never spoke about why. The families may have been spared the agony of a prolonged trial, but they weren't given the one thing they desperately wanted: answers. And though Kohberger will now rot in prison for the rest of his life, the scars of what he did will never fade from the town of Moscow. The home where the crime occurred has since been demolished, but its memory still casts a long, dark shadow. Yet some believe the story isn't over. Whispers have begun to surface about Kohberger's past, about other unsolved cases, about eerie similarities between crimes that span across state lines. Was this truly his first and only act of violence? Or was it just the one he got caught for? When Bryan Kohberger pled guilty to the brutal slayings of 4 University of Idaho students, the world believed the case had finally come to an end. With 4 consecutive life sentences now confirmed, many assumed justice had been served. But behind closed doors, investigators weren't ready to close the book, because unsettling questions still lingered. And one of them stood above the rest. Was this Kohberger's first time killing, or the first time he got caught? The evidence that convicted Kohberger was overwhelming: DNA, phone records, surveillance footage. But what truly unnerved seasoned agents was how calculated the crime had been. The method, the planning, the silence. It was not the work of someone acting on impulse. It was the signature of someone who had rehearsed. Federal investigators began retracing his steps, not just in Idaho, but far beyond. Bryan Kohberger had lived in multiple states, attended several universities, and traveled extensively across the country over the past decade. He'd moved through Pennsylvania, Washington, Idaho, and even briefly through Colorado and Nevada. In each of those places, unsolved cases remained. The FBI quietly began re-examining cold cases, particularly those with similar elements: young victims, knife wounds, late-night attacks, and a conspicuous lack of motive. One case, in particular, sent a chill down the spine of the Special Task Force reviewing his background. In 2020, nearly 2 years before the Idaho murders, a young woman named Chelsea LaRue was found dead in her small apartment just outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, Kohberger's hometown. She had been stabbed multiple times while sleeping. No sign of forced entry. No sexual assault. No robbery. Her phone and wallet were untouched. The case had gone cold after 6 months. At the time, Kohberger was living nearby, completing his undergraduate degree in psychology and criminology at DeSales University. He worked as a security guard and reportedly kept to himself. There was no known connection to Chelsea, at least not then. But when FBI analysts ran a side-by-side comparison of the Idaho crime scene and the LaRue file, the similarities were alarming. The angle of entry, the tight window of time, the type of blade used, nearly identical. And most chilling of all, Chelsea's body had been found next to her bed, and near her pillow was a leather sheath. It had never been processed for DNA. When agents rushed to reopen the evidence box, they discovered the sheath had been damaged during original processing, contaminated. Whatever DNA had been on it was now long gone. Still, the coincidence was too strong to ignore. Another case surfaced in Pullman, Washington, just a few miles from where Kohberger attended graduate school. In April 2021, a graduate student named Daniel Wexler disappeared without a trace. His car was found abandoned near a hiking trail. No sign of struggle. His body was never recovered. Initially ruled a missing persons case, the file was nearly forgotten. But when Kohberger was arrested in December 2022, agents noticed something disturbing in his search history. Among various online forums he had frequented, there was a deep-dive Reddit post he'd bookmarked, an anonymous discussion about the Wexler case. The post included crime scene photos and speculative theories. Investigators began to wonder if Kohberger had not only followed the disappearance, but had orchestrated it. More red flags began to emerge from his time at DeSales University. In 2021, as part of a research project, Kohberger created a public survey asking former criminals to describe their emotions during the commission of a crime. On the surface, it looked academic. But the questions raised serious concerns. How did you feel right before the act? What did you do to prepare? Did you plan the attack or act on impulse? How did you leave the scene without being caught? To the average person, it might seem like an odd curiosity. But to behavioral analysts, it read like a blueprint, a window into someone planning something far more sinister than research. As agents dug deeper, they uncovered more troubling signs. His internet footprint included visits to obscure crime forums, dark web discussions about concealment techniques, and multiple searches about how long DNA lasts on surfaces. He had even looked up specific national parks, isolated areas often associated with unsolved disappearances. Then came the most disturbing discovery yet. On a recovered hard drive from Kohberger's parents' home in Pennsylvania, digital forensics uncovered a hidden folder of writings. It included journal-style entries, dozens of them, many written in second-person perspective. Phrases like, "You watch them from a distance again tonight. They don't know you're there. But you know their patterns. You test the door. It's unlocked. This time, you won't forget the gloves." The silence after is louder than anything you've ever heard. To prosecutors, they read like fiction. But to profilers? They read like confessions. Still, the question remained. If Kohberger had done this before, where were the bodies? Why had nothing been conclusively linked? Some believe that Kohberger's academic background made him uniquely skilled in avoiding detection. He would have known how to disable surveillance, how to avoid DNA transfer, how to choose victims with no traceable link. The Idaho case, they now believe, may have been the first time he slipped up, the only time he left behind something as damning as DNA. But then, an even more horrifying theory emerged. What if Kohberger's goal was not just murder, but the study of murder? What if he saw his victims as part of an evolving experiment, each one teaching him how to improve? And if that was true, how many victims had come before? Now, investigators in at least 5 states are reviewing unsolved cases from the past 6 years, cases with unexplained elements, missing persons, or knife attacks without motive. And behind every folder, one question echoes. Is Bryan Kohberger a serial killer hiding in plain sight? Publicly, law enforcement has remained tight-lipped. But privately, multiple agencies are now collaborating across state lines. Behavioral analysts are working round the clock. Victim families in Pennsylvania and Washington have received quiet outreach from federal contacts. Meanwhile, in the maximum security prison where Kohberger now resides, he remains silent. No interviews. No confessions. No statements. His legal team insists he has nothing more to say. That the Idaho case was isolated. But the evidence says otherwise. And then came something no one expected. A woman in Oregon stepped forward. She claimed that in 2020, she had been followed for weeks by a man in a white sedan. He never approached. Never spoke. But he was always there. Parked near her job. Outside her gym. Once, even behind her apartment. She filed a report at the time, but with no clear threat, it went nowhere. After seeing Kohberger's face on the news years later, she broke into tears. She was certain it was him. Police have now reopened that report. One by one, the puzzle pieces are falling into place. Not fast enough for some, but fast enough to terrify anyone watching the full picture emerge. And then, just days ago, a letter arrived at the Idaho State Correctional Center. No return address. Inside was a single sentence typed in block letters. You caught one of us, but not all. Was it a hoax? A prank? Or something far darker? Because now, a new theory is beginning to form. One that suggests Kohberger may not have acted alone. That he may have been part of something bigger. Something more organized. A hidden network with shared intent and shared blood. And if that's true, then this case is far from over. A letter. Just 10 words, typed in block capital letters. You caught one of us, but not all. That was the message sent anonymously to the Idaho State Correctional Center in the weeks following Bryan Kohberger's guilty plea. No fingerprints. No return address. Postmarked from Oregon. To many, it was a sick prank. A hoax, likely crafted by someone chasing notoriety. But to federal investigators still digging through Kohberger's digital footprint and movement history, the note was anything but harmless. Because evidence, real, tangible, and chilling, was beginning to suggest something darker, that Kohberger might not have been alone. In the aftermath of his arrest, investigators had begun retracing every step of his adult life, examining his time in Pennsylvania, Washington, and Idaho. But what they found, buried deep in encrypted folders and anonymous Reddit accounts, wasn't just the mind of a killer. It was the voice of a man who believed he wasn't the only one. On one forum, an anonymous user, later confirmed through IP mapping to be Kohberger, had participated in disturbing conversations dating back years. The threads weren't just about murder psychology or criminal theory. They were about methodology, strategy, communication. One recurring thread was titled simply, "The Pact." It was obscure, buried behind private subforums and password-protected message boards, known only to a select group of users. The posts were vague, coded, often written in a second-person narrative. But the meaning was clear. This was a digital gathering of individuals who shared a singular obsession, planning the perfect murder. And among them, Kohberger wasn't a lurker. He was a leader. Agents retrieved dozens of posts under pseudonyms he had used across various platforms. In one, dated October 8, 2022, just 5 weeks before the Idaho murders, he wrote, "There is no feeling like the calm before. When the world is asleep and you are not. When you are not just studying death. You are becoming it." Another post, from a user believed to be a different member of the group, read, "We operate in silence. The pact is for those who act, not those who watch." Investigators now believe the pact may have been more than just a digital echo chamber. It may have been a loosely connected network of like-minded individuals, people who shared techniques, case studies, and even targets. Not a cult, not a gang, but a modern shadow network, bonded not by location but by purpose. Kohberger's devices contained message drafts never sent, journal entries detailing others who understood. One chilling note simply read, "They're watching Oregon. New blood there." Then came a breakthrough. Using metadata hidden in one of Kohberger's encrypted backup files, the FBI traced an IP address linked to another user of the pact, a man living in Northern California. His real name, Adam Collier, a 33-year-old with no criminal record, working as a wilderness survival instructor. Authorities quietly began monitoring him. Then, in May 2025, just 6 months after Kohberger's sentencing, Collier was arrested after attempting to abduct a female hiker in Redwood National Park. In his backpack, a military-style knife, zip ties, duct tape, and a digital storage drive labeled simply, "Trials." Inside the drive were detailed maps, surveillance photos, victim profiles, and among them, a folder labeled BRK, believed to stand for Bryan Richard Kohberger. It contained over 50 pages of messages between Collier and a still unidentified individual. Messages referencing success rates, entry techniques, and, most disturbingly, King Road Protocol. King Road being the street in Moscow where the Idaho murders occurred. Collier eventually confessed, but not in the way authorities expected. He claimed that the pact was real. That Kohberger was one of several, and that they communicated strictly through encrypted channels and burner accounts. According to Collier, they didn't know each other's real names. But they inspired each other, pushed boundaries, shared victories, compared notes. They didn't kill together, he said, they killed to compete. This revelation reframed the Idaho case. Kohberger hadn't just been a lone wolf with a fascination for crime. He had been part of a covert collective, and his arrest had rattled them. But here's where the story takes its final, terrifying turn. In August 2025, the FBI raided an off-grid cabin in central Montana after Collier gave up coordinates during interrogation. There, they found a makeshift operation, computers, burner phones, maps, and in a hidden drawer, 6 printed photographs. All of young adults. All missing. All unsolved cases across 3 different states. And in the corner of each photo, a handwritten letter, C. The same signature Collier used on the PAC's forums. The same initial investigators suspect dozens of other users might have adopted. Federal authorities now consider at least 11 open homicide investigations as potentially connected to members of this group. Kohberger's name appears in at least 4. But no other members have yet been identified. Collier, under a protective custody agreement, has refused to release more names, claiming doing so would make him a target. "They're still out there," he said during one recorded interview. "You don't understand. He was the loudest one, but not the smartest." Back in Idaho, Kohberger has remained completely silent about any involvement with the pact. He refuses all interviews, all media requests, all correspondence. But according to prison staff, he receives handwritten letters weekly, each postmarked from different cities, each unsigned. The contents are cryptic. Things like, "Still watching. You weren't the last. C rests, but the circle lives." Authorities believe these letters are coming from others within the network, sent as either warnings or tributes. Today, Bryan Kohberger remains behind bars, serving his 4 consecutive life sentences. But his legacy, if you can call it that, has only grown darker. What began as a singular, horrific crime in a quiet college town has become something far more complex. A glimpse into a digital underground where murder is a study, a challenge, even an art. The home where Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan once lived is gone, torn down in the hope of helping the community heal. But the questions Kohberger left behind remain buried in the minds of those still seeking justice. Because if the pact is real, and if its members are still active, then the story doesn't end in Idaho. It spreads. But this is where we leave Bryan Kohberger, a man who tried to outsmart the system, who believed he could become the perfect predator, who thought his intellect would shield him. And yet, it was a single mistake, a fingerprint of DNA on a knife sheath, that brought his world crashing down. In the end, no matter how calculated, no matter how cruel or clever, evil leaves a trace. It always does. And for those still hiding in the shadows, those who believe they are invisible, there's one final message. We see you. If you found this story as chilling and compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue bringing real stories to light, stories that deserve to be heard.